So good evening, everyone. Thanks again for joining us. Those that were here for our first session, Austin Zwick, who led that session, has joined us this evening also. And Austin, thanks for coming back, and thank you again for what you did a couple of weeks ago. As I mentioned at the start of Austin's session, and I want to just reiterate here, we do this not because we are unaware of what is happening in the world and what's happening in Israel in particular, but with an awareness of that and a recognition that our tradition has always been to, even in the midst of sorrow and darkness, to be, as I spoke last night, to be those points of light, to celebrate life. And that Torah, and I do believe that what we're going to study tonight very much is Torah needs to continue, even amongst, and particularly amidst times when it is most difficult to do, or others would squash it out. And so I think what we're doing here is as much an act of resistance and solidarity with the Jewish people and the people of Israel as what we did last night at the vigil and what we've done for the last 30 days. So I have only gotten to know our speaker this evening through his writing and some brief email exchanges, but David Tzvi Kalman is with us this evening. And when I, like many rabbis, said, okay, I've got, and this is all pre, everything that was happening in Israel, and even a little bit pre the democracy stuff. I got to give a sermon about AI. That's the topic of the day for the high holidays. Remember when we were just worried about AI taking over the world, and that was our biggest concern? Looking around for Jewish sources, there were only a few, and then amongst those few, there was David Tzvi's work, which really spoke in such an accessible and I think thoughtful and deep way, taking this complex topic, and as I used his frame of the matzah machine, helping to contextualize it in the sense of Jewish history. So David Tzvi, we are thrilled to have you and we welcome you. I'll just share David Tzvi's brief bio. He's a scholar and an entrepreneur, works in the intersection of religion, technology, and ethics. I kind of feel like sometimes I work in that intersection also, but I think you do better in the intersection than I do. Since 2019, he has served as a scholar in residence and the director of new media at the Sholom Human Institute of North America. The Hartman Institute, of course, we know well with our connection with Yossi Klein Halevi, also in our congregation. He's the owner of Print O Craft Press and the Knops Art House. He's been quoted in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and his writing appears in many outlets, including Slate, the LA Times, JTA, Jewish Telegraph Agency, Haaretz, Tablet, and The Forward. And I love that you have a blog that's called Jello Menorah, which maybe at some point you can explain where that name comes from also. I'll just remind everybody to keep your mics on mute for the time being. If you have questions, the chat or the Q&A function at the bottom is probably the best way to do it. But I think our presentation this evening, just talking with David Tzvi beforehand, you may just open it up for dialogue and conversation. We seem to have a little more manageable number this evening. And so, David Tzvi, I turn it over to you and to navigate and negotiate this however you would like.
Thank you. It's really a pleasure to be learning with you today. I'm going to share the sources in the chat, and I'll pull them up on screen in a second. As for why it's called Jello Menorah, the answer is simply that if you Google the words Jello Menorah, only one thing shows up. So, meaning is important, but also, Google SEO is important too. Okay. So what I want to do today is talk about artificial intelligence in law. But before I do that, I kind of want to give a little bit of an explanation about why this is an area where Jews ought to be in the first place. Because the truth of the matter is, Jews can be talking about all kinds of things. There's certainly areas of ethics that are kind of easier reachers for Jewish law, issues around immigration, issues around charity, in the U.S., certainly issues around abortion. These are areas where there's quite a bit to say and quite a bit has been said around what it means to have a Jewish perspective on these issues. Artificial intelligence, also things like genetic editing, virtual reality, legalization of different psychoactive substances. These are areas where Judaism does not actually have that much to say yet. And I want to make the argument that it's quite important that Judaism kind of step up. And to do that, I want to bring a source that, as someone who is affiliated with the Sholom Human Institute, I feel I have a kind of obligation to use the source, because this is a source that was actually popularized by David Hartman in the last few decades. There is so much Talmud, and it's basically impossible to learn all of it. And the sources that become the most popular, the most important, are often the ones that people point to and say, like, this is one that you should probably look at. So this is a kind of story which it starts in a weird place, and it kind of goes in an even weirder place. The story starts with the Mishnah in Kalim. Kalim is a tractate. It's actually the longest tractate in the entire Mishnah, which is kind of one of the central works of rabbinic law, written in the 3rd century. And it discusses issues of ritual purity and impurity. It's not actually important exactly what that means right now, other than to note that there are certain areas of Jewish law that are at the forefront of technological discussions. In the modern period, what's the area of Jewish law that is like most in contact with technology? What do you think?
I would say medical ethics.
Medical ethics definitely is true. Medical ethics is kind of like centuries old, and really kind of kicks off this idea that Judaism is this body of knowledge that needs to be in conversation with this other body of knowledge. There's another area of law where Judaism, which is constantly being bombarded by questions of can you do this, which is Shabbat, because Shabbat is an area where basically every time a new technology comes out, you can ask, can I use this technology on Shabbat? And so there's a constant series of questions being generated by the rules for Shabbat around new technologies. In the past, in the times of the rabbis, there was another area of law that was also very susceptible to technological change, and that was discussions of ritual purity and impurity, because for any object, you can always ask about that object, can this object become ritually impure? Some objects can be, some cannot, depends on whether they're made of clay or metal or glass or whatever else. Okay, so the general rule is that objects which are not functional for human use, just like a lump of clay, cannot become ritually impure. Objects that can be used, that have been fashioned into utensils, then they have the ability to become ritually impure. So a lump of clay is not a problem, but if you turn something into an oven can become ritually impure. Now, one rabbi has a very clever idea, and his clever idea is, well, what if I take an oven back then, imagine, is basically being like kind of like a large pot, right? If I take an oven and I cut it up into rings, kind of imagine it cut diagonally, these large circular rings, I stack them on top of each other such that it is functionally the same device. It's again works as an oven, but technically it's not. Technically what's going on here is that I just have a set of rings, and I can ask about each ring, is this ring susceptible to ritual impurity? No, because it's just a ring. A ring doesn't have any purpose. And I can ask about the next ring. Can this ring be used for anything? No. So it's not susceptible to ritual impurity. It's basically a way of working around the law, getting around the law by artificially creating this device that has no other purpose than to skirt this law. So that's the first source. If an oven's cut into rings and sand is placed between each ring, Rabbi Eliezer says, sure, you can use that. This workaround works totally fine. And the sages forbid it. And this is called the oven of Achnai. That's just the name of it. So in the Mishnah, that's where the discussion ends. In the Talmud, written in the centuries after this little debate blows up into a gigantic fight. And I've actually not even given you the entirety of the fight. I've only given you the first part, which is the part that's normally quoted, where the debate between Rabbi Eliezer on the one hand and the sages on the other hand doesn't end there. Rabbi Eliezer said to the sages, if the halacha agrees with me, if my reading of the law is correct, let this carob tree prove it. Thereupon the carob tree was torn 100 cubits out of its place, others are from 400 cubits. That is to say, rather than making an argument on the merits, rather than making a logical argument, rather than appealing to like some set of biblical sources, he tries to evoke the laws of nature. He says, like, I'm going to use a miracle to prove to you that my position on this random law is correct. And so they respond to him saying, that doesn't quite work. No proof can be brought from a carob tree. Again, he said to them, if the halacha agrees with me, let the stream of water prove it. Whereupon the stream of water flows backwards. So again, he is trying to change the laws of nature in order to prove that his ruling on this position is correct. And the rabbis kind of keep coming back to him saying, like, It doesn't work that way. That's not how we make legal decisions. And other people have noted that the way that he is modifying nature is actually always destructive, right? He's uprooting trees, he's making rivers go backwards, things like that. It goes on and on and on. If you look around 8 lines from the bottom of this paragraph, it kind of reaches a climax. Rabbi Eliezer says to the sages, if the law agrees with me, let it be proved from heaven. Whereupon a heavenly voice cries out, why do you dispute with Rabbi Eliezer, seeing that in all matters the law agrees with him? But Rabbi Yeshua rose and exclaimed, it is not in heaven. That is to say, Rabbi Eliezer literally gets up and says, I am going to get God to tell you that I am right. God, a voice calls out and says, Rabbi Eliezer's right. Why are you arguing with him? And the sages say, we don't care. We are right anyways. Which is like the most chutzpahdik thing, is like the kind of the nerve of the rabbis who say this, basically making the argument that, listen, God gave the Jews the law. That means God doesn't have it anymore. The Jews have it. And if the Jews have it, they are the ones who ultimately get to decide how it goes. And God actually isn't the ultimate arbiter of what law is right and what law is wrong. There's a nice coda to this story. If you look at 3 lines from the bottom of this paragraph, Rabbi Nathan met Elijah the prophet, and said, what did the Holy One, blessed be he, do in that hour? Meaning, like, what did he think? What did God think after the fact about this conversation? And Elijah laughs with joy and replies, my sons have defeated me, my sons have defeated me. That is to say, in Elijah's reading, God is actually happy that this happened because, in the same way that sometimes a parent is like a little bit happy that their kids have rebelled because it suggests they're kind of independent. Something similar is going on here, where God's kind of happy that the rabbis have rebelled and have kind of asserted their independence from God's law. What I love about this last line is like the extra chutzpah that the rabbis are like telling a story in which they say, oh yeah, not only are we right, but also God says that we're right. Meaning, like, they're constructing a story in which they get God to agree with them too, which is like, I love it. I like, this is one of the things I love most about rabbinic literature, like the ability to kind of shape Jewish theology in this pretty radical way. All of this entire discussion happens because of an oven. And you might think, like, this is like such a big discussion to have, right? This is a discussion about the nature of rabbinic authority, about the relationship between the rabbis and God, about the nature of Jewish law. Why would it start out from such a weird and obscure place? And the answer, I think, is that the oven it's not really about the oven, of course, right? The oven is just the way the conversation starts. The oven is what you might call a catalyst. It's a catalyst for the conversation. It's a catalyst for the conversation because the oven represents a kind of new technology. It's a technology which forces the rabbis to have a debate that they would not have had otherwise, forces them to think about what is actually the important part of the law here. Is it about the spirit of the law? Is it about the letter of the law? And so they end up in this conversation. In the ancient world, debates like this come along every once in a while because technology doesn't develop so quickly in the ancient world. We are living in a world in which ovens like this, debates like this, are happening constantly. They're happening all the time. By which I mean that we are living in a world in which the world is moving at a speed that Judaism is unused to, frankly, that all religions are unused to. Religions are not generally known for being fast. Religions are sometimes actually pride themselves on being quite slow. And this creates a kind of dilemma. On the one hand, you have a world which is moving quickly, in which new moral problems are being raised all the time around the use of artificial intelligence and genetic editing and all the rest. And on the other hand, you have Judaism, which is learning how to kind of get up to speed on these issues. What does it mean to get up to speed on matters that it has never had to think about seriously before? And this is like a real revolution that's happening right now, and it's going to take a while to get up to speed because I think the inclination is to kind of to say, listen, we're going to keep going along, we're going to plod slowly along. And what I am concerned about is if Judaism kind of continues at that pace, by the time it gets to its decisions around how to think about things like artificial intelligence, it will have been far too late, right? We live in a world in which the first mover advantage on issues of technology is gigantic, and so being slow is a moral problem, I think. And so because of that, I think there's a real need to go out of the way to develop proactively responses to things like artificial intelligence before everyone else does, to actually be one of the first to kind of think about these issues seriously and thoroughly. So that's the kind of the premise here. And so what I want to do today is kind of think about what does that mean? What are the implications of that for the way we think about law? And by law, I mean not just artificial intelligence regulation, but also Jewish law. And that's kind of the framework that I want to use today. On the one hand, what does it mean to talk about Judaism as having an impact on the regulation of artificial intelligence? And on the other hand, how can we expect artificial intelligence to impact the way that we think about Jewish law? Let me stop there and just ask if there's any questions, anything I should clarify. Let's keep going.
Yeah, I think, David, there's one question here in the Q&A about freedom of speech, but I'm not sure what that was in reference to. Maybe that was back to your original question about areas that Judaism and technology had a nexus.
I'll add one more thing, which is that this is hard. It's hard for a lot of reasons. It's hard in part because the structure of Jewish leadership is not set up to respond quickly to new technologies. A lot of people who decide they want to become Jewish leaders don't decide they want to become Jewish leaders to do AI regulation. If they wanted to do AI regulation, they would have gone to work for a tech company instead. And so it's difficult for that reason. It's also difficult because it's actually hard to figure out what Judaism has to say about these issues. And here I want to show you a text that kind of gets to that. This is actually not a new problem. It's a problem that's at least 100 years old. 100 years ago, the chief rabbi of Cairo, Raphael Aram ben Simon, was asked this kind of this question that at first glance seems like this kind of little, this question which, how could somebody be asking such a big question in such a small way? But someone asks him, I need to know two things. First of all, can I strike a match on Shabbat? Does that constitute starting a fire? And on the other hand, can I use electricity on Shabbat? Which are two kind of important questions for the way that certainly Orthodox Jews imagine that they observe Shabbat. So Ben Simon gives a response, but before he gives a response, he has this kind of groaning preamble where he says, "Friend, many times I've told you in confidence how difficult it is for a teacher in these times to answer questions like whether it's permissible to use matches or electricity on Shabbat and Yom Tov, because new inventions of this variety come each day. There sparkle new inventions which our fathers and elders never imagined." That is to say, he's acknowledging the fact that part of what makes his life difficult, his job difficult, is that he has to actually go through mounds and mounds of text to find what is relevant in the sources to these new areas of law. And so that actually takes time. It's its own kind of project. Now, this is a project that, just in terms of speed, is difficult, but it's also the kind of project that rabbis have dealt with in the past. And just to kind of show you one example of what a full-throated rabbinic response looks like, there are all kinds of areas in which rabbis have had quite a bit to say in really detailed terms around how to think about certain areas of law. One really classic example of this is the laws of lost objects. So in the Bible, there's kind of very simple regulation. Someone loses an object, give it back to them. Couldn't be more simple. Someone loses an object, give it back to them. This is pretty simple if you're living in a small community. If you're living in a community which is rural, where you basically know all the people around you, you're I know whose donkey that is. I know whose thing that is. You can just return it to them. Once you move into urban environments, it becomes much harder to figure out whose objects belong to whom. And so the rabbis have a choice. They can either say, well, we're going to give you some broad principles about how do you decide what objects get to return and which objects you just don't bother because you'll never find the owner. Or they could actually do the hard work of telling you in detail about the objects in their surroundings, which objects should be returned and which objects should not be. And they go that harder route. They actually take the effort to think about those regulations, think in detail about the specific kinds of objects that you might need to return, might not need to return. This is the kind of law which people look at today and their eyes glaze over because it is so time specific. It is so specific to the rabbi's era and their specific location. But at the same time, this is the essence of regulation. It looks like this. It's often exactly this detailed and requires maintenance to preserve. So there are reasons to take this seriously. It is a hard project. I think it's an important project. So let's think about what it might mean to imagine that Judaism has something to say about artificial intelligence regulation. Well, and the framework that I want to use, at least for these first sources, is the kind of artificial intelligence that makes decisions for people, right? We think about, and maybe this was covered last time, there's different kinds of artificial intelligences. The one that I think kind of kickstarted the conversation that we're having today is ChatGPT, which is a generative AI, right? An AI that is capable of kind of creating all kinds of original text and images, audio, whatever else it is. But there's another kind of artificial intelligence that is about decision making. And that's the kind of artificial intelligence which shows up in things like self-driving cars. So that's the kind of the context for these sources. How do you think about the liabilities around self-driving cars, the ethics of self-driving cars within the context of Jewish law? If you have a Tesla and the Tesla hits somebody, God forbid, who's responsible for that? Is it the car's responsibility, whatever that means? Is the responsibility of the driver? Is the responsibility of the car company? How might you think about that? Now, one avenue you might take is to think, well, the rabbis didn't have self-driving cars, but they did have animals. And animals also, like self-driving cars, kind of have a mind of their own. And at the same time, they're controlled by their owners. Perhaps there is some analogy to be made here. And here I want to show you some text that seem to be getting that. I'm also let me see if I can resize the screen just to make this a little bit easier to read. I'm so sorry about this. Okay. All right, so source number 5. This again is a Mishnah in Baba Kama. The Mishnah says, there's basically 2 different categories of animal when you want to think about liability. There is what is called a tam and a muad. And the Mishnah, it describes to you what the difference between those 2 is. Which type of ox is considered innocuous, a tam, and which is considered forewarned, muad. An ox is forewarned where people testify that it gored on 3 consecutive days. It reverts to being innocuous if it refrains for 3 days. This is the position of Rabbi Yehuda. That is to say, there is a different legal category for an animal that commits damage if the animal has a history of committing damage. If you know that this tends to be a dangerous animal, then you are punished more severely if it damages again because you should have known better. So that is the category here. Tam is an animal which has no history of violence. Muad does have a history of violence. Then the rabbis talk about how does one get from one category to the other. So the first opinion says, well, it's about, what was it doing the last 3 days? If it was like literally, every day for the last 3 days, it was goring somebody, well, maybe you shouldn't take it out again. Rabbi Meir says, no, it's forewarned when people testify that it gored 3 times, regardless of when these occurrences took place, but then it reverts to being innocuous if children pet it and it does not gore them. That is to say, it's not about like literally how many times did this animal hurt somebody. It's instead, has it hurt people in the past? And at the same time, is it the kind of animal that children feel comfortable being around? However you split it, there is this idea, this distinction that shows up that there are certain kinds of behaviors which should signal to a person, hey, maybe you should be more careful with this animal. Maybe you shouldn't bring it into public spaces. And maybe you should be aware of that. And the law suggests that there is liability that follows from that expectation of awareness. So that's one piece of this. The Mishnah then goes on to think about another way to imagine rules around a tam and a muad, the innocuous and the forewarned animal. There's certain animals, not oxen, that are just always dangerous, right? A lion, a wolf, a bear, a leopard, snakes, they're just considered forewarned. They're always dangerous. You should never have an expectation that you can bring a bear out into the street and everything is going to be fine. That's just not how bears work. And so there is a sense that even when you can kind of predict the behavior of animals, even when you can sometimes look at an animal's behavioral history to understand how it might behave, there are certain categories of animal, or like, let's kind of like take the analogy farther, there's certain kinds of AI which are just so liable to some kind of violence. There's so much of a chance that they'll do something wrong that you should just never take the risk. And you could imagine kind of taking the idea behind this and extend it in all kinds of different directions. So for example, you might take this in the direction of facial recognition. facial recognition is a kind of software which is often backed by artificial intelligence, allowing computers to determine easily, based on a person's face, who they are, have it have that face kind of be put in conversation with the other faces that the person has, all their personal information, or do things like look at a person's face and identify them by race or by gender or mood or things like that. Facial recognition is a technology which I've argued elsewhere probably shouldn't exist. And it probably shouldn't exist because the ability to abuse it is so high that the advantages of it simply are outweighed by the ways that can go wrong. It's already being used in places like China, in authoritarian regimes, as a way to suppress people, as a way to kind of automatically racially identify people. And so there's just too many problems with it, and so it should be ignored. Whether you agree with me or not, this is an example I want to give you of kinds of artificial intelligences that should simply be ruled out in the way that, you don't bring a leopard into a public square and think everything is going to be okay. You don't say like, well, people are going to make their own decisions around like how they act, and ultimately it's about the way that society treats this. No, some things are just dangerous. And so that's the suggestion here. The last piece of this is to say that human beings are in their own category, and human beings never get to say that they have no history of violence. And this is certain source number 7. A person is always considered forewarned, always considered muad, whether the damage they committed was intentional or unintentional, whether done awake or asleep, whether a person blinded another person's eye or broke their vessels. No matter what, you always pay the full cost of the damages. That is to say that human beings have a special kind of limit in how much they can argue that they are not responsible for something. And there's a kind of assumption of liability. There's a kind of assumption of responsibility on the part of human beings. Even if they're sleeping, maybe they should have slept somewhere else. Maybe they should have had the kind of foresight to know that they were sleeping in the wrong place, things like that. And so again, you can imagine using this as a way to think about responsibility around artificial intelligence, and particularly responsibility around its developers. That is to say, one of the things that happens in conversation around artificial intelligence is there is a kind of to editorialize a little bit, a bit of a smokescreen around this is a technology that's new, it's unprecedented, we don't know exactly how it works, and because of all these things, therefore the liability of the developers should be limited, because we didn't know. How could we possibly know that the technology could have evolved in a certain direction? I think the kind of sources like this suggest that the tendency should be towards assuming greater liability and not lesser liability, and that we should give a kind of high bar around when a person can actually be absolved of the responsibility for technology that may go off the rails. So I think there's something here. Going back to the Tesla example, thinking about where the kind of balance of responsibility lies between the driver of the car and the car's creators, we can also look at another source which suggests a kind of way to think about this. The Ramban, Nachmanides, who's a medieval Spanish commentator, talks about when a person is more liable to the damage that is committed by an animal. It says the liability for an animal's damage is stated because when a person plows with his animal, he puts a yoke on it and he controls it by force of his hands, and it remains under his control. Any labor is done for the person and it depends on him, and the animal is no more than a tool in the hands of the artisan. So if the animal is fully controlled by the person, then the person is responsible for everything the animal does. That is not compatible with the donkey driver, because for a donkey driver, the animal walks of its own accord, even if it's somewhat mindful of the donkey driver. So if you have more control over an animal, if the animal is not able to exert any kind of independence, then it's really just the responsibility of the driver. If the animal has some kind of independence, then maybe take that into consideration as well. I want to give you one more example of one more direction you could take this. And this goes to the idea of autonomy. When you are responsible for autonomous actions or not responsible for autonomous actions. And here it gets to something which is more complicated, which is that sometimes the way that we think about liability in these cases is not so clear cut. It's hard to actually create the right rule. One of the things that the rabbis do is, in thinking about the laws of Shabbat, they have to update them around the rise of machinery. right? In the Bible, there is not yet any machinery that can kind of take advantage of the forces of nature to do work. By the time that the rabbis are writing, they have the water wheel accessible to them. The water wheel is this kind of the beginning of a new category of machines that use natural energy in order to do all kinds of work. And so the rabbis have this question: can I use a water wheel on Shabbat? Does using a water wheel on Shabbat violate Shabbat? Or am I just, setting something in motion, but it's ultimately not my responsibility? And you can.
Did we lose everybody?
I think we might have just lost David.
Okay.
Ari is here.
Okay. Hopefully he'll come back in a moment. Hanging on every word. Hopefully everything's okay in Philadelphia where he is.
Can you all hear me?
We can hear you now. We've lost your video.
Oh, yeah, I turned off the screen just because make sure I can see you.
Yeah.
Okay.
We got you back. Okay.
You got me back. Okay, great. All right. Let me start sharing the screen again. Tell me if you lose my connection. So there's a kind of tension here. On the one hand, you can imagine there's a kind of responsibility for the actions done by a water wheel on Shabbat because, well, I'm the one setting it in motion. I knew it was going to be doing that thing on Shabbat, therefore I'm responsible. On the other hand, you can imagine, well, maybe I'm not responsible because I am not physically doing that thing on Shabbat. I'm setting it in motion, but it's out of sight, out of mind. So the rabbis kind of have a set of issues like this that they want to go through. Well, can I set up a water course in advance of Shabbat so that my plants are watered on Shabbat, but I'm not the one watering them because me watering them on Shabbat would be a problem? That's fine. Could I put some kind of chemicals on a silver object so that a kind of chemical reaction happens on Shabbat, but I'm not the one doing it? That's fine. But when it comes to water wheels, the rabbis kind of turn around and they say in the last two lines in here in source number 9, you're not allowed to put wheat in a water mill unless it's for the purpose of grinding that may be completed before Shabbat begins. That is to say, there's all kinds of activities that I can start before Shabbat, just set in motion, and it's fine because I'm not the one actively doing that thing on Shabbat. But water wheels are different. I'm not allowed to put grain into a water mill so that it gets crushed on Shabbat, even if I'm not the one actively doing the crushing. Now, before looking at the reason for this, I'm curious if you have any thoughts about why this might be. Why do you think that the rules around a water mill might be different from the rules around anything else? Why might I not be allowed to set a water wheel in motion on Friday in order to have it do work for me on Saturday?
I'm going to guess because you're doing it intentionally and it's only for your own purpose.
Right. So one reason might be that it's a kind of intentional action. The issue is that all of the actions listed in source number 9, they're all intentional. They're all attempts to do work on purpose in order to get something done on Shabbat that I would not be able to do directly on Shabbat because it would be a violation of the laws. Yeah, Norman.
The water wheel is a tool invented by humans and seems to have there's more agency of the person doing that than with natural processes such as silver and sulfur and such that, that God created in a sense.
Right. So I think you're trying to feel your way towards the idea that it feels more I'm trying to think of the word. It's a tool that's created by humans. Of course, sulfur is also a kind of tool that's created by humans. Waterways are also a tool, but there's something about the water wheel in that it's maybe a more sophisticated of a tool, and so I can't use it. Any other thoughts about why a water wheel might be different from other kinds of objects in this regard?
Hi, I'm Emily. My thought is that it has to do with the aspect of the element being water, and that water goes back to life. I often had a joke as a child that when we would raise our glass of water, instead of saying l'chaim, we would say l'mayim.
So there's something about water that's different. Of course,
Yeah.
the issue is that at the beginning of this text, it also talks about a water source, when you can aim water towards a garden, which will water the garden on Friday. And so on the Saturday, the garden will be watered. Let me give you the answer that the Talmud gives, because this text does not actually explain the answer, but the Talmud's curious about why this happens. So the Talmud, discussing this text centuries later, says, the beginning of source number 10, why? Rabbah says, because the water wheel makes noise. That's the reason. Someone want to explain that? Why is the noisiness of the water wheel relevant here?
Takes away from being able to connect with Hashem.
Right. So there's something, it's not just about the kind of formally what action is being done. It's something about feeling your way towards an experience of a day. And because it so happens that the water wheel is kind of conspicuous in its activity, it is more problematic than other kinds of automated or predetermined activity. I'll give you kind of like another example of this where like it shows up certainly in my Shabbat practice, and I know like everyone's Shabbat practice is a little bit different, so like your results may vary. But in our house we have a semi-smart home, which means that we have lights going on all the time and off, and they're set so that the heat and the cool are set to certain temperatures on Shabbat, and the lights go off at certain times of Shabbat, and like that's all fine, and like none of that feels weird in any way. There was one day, when my wife and I had just purchased a Roomba, like a vacuum robot, and we said, hey, why wouldn't it be great if we set this to start vacuuming the house every Friday night, right after we have our nice Shabbat meal? By the time the morning comes along, the house will be nice and clean. So we set it up, and 10 o'clock at night, we hear a noise, and all of a sudden there's like a robot crawling on the room, and there was like something about it that just felt off. And I don't know that I could tell you exactly what it is that felt off about it. I don't know formally that there was anything that different about it, but it felt like this is out of step with the way that I understand the observance of Shabbat. The reason I mention this is because kind of transferring this idea to that of artificial intelligence, sometimes I think we are able to create kind of like hard and fast rules around the areas where artificial intelligence should and should not be part of society. But I think a lot of the time, there is also something to be said around our kind of natural intuitions around what is and is not appropriate. Just to give one example of this, a number of years ago, Google was experimenting with a piece of software that would use a realistic human voice to call up, say, like the hairdresser and make an appointment for you. So it would have a conversation with the person on the phone, make the appointment, then hang up, without revealing at any point in the conversation that it was not a human being, that it was just a machine. People had a kind of instant visceral response to this, saying like, this is not okay. You can't have a robot pretending it's a person having a conversation with on the phone like that. It should be clearer that the thing talking to a human being on the phone is not actually human in some way. It has to identify itself in some way. Now, why was this the particular line that people felt like you can't cross this line? I think it's a little bit unclear. But I think there is something to be said about taking those lines seriously and respecting them as actually having some value and interrogating like what is behind them. So that shows up a lot. I think that is important in imagining artificial intelligence regulation, not just as being something that kind of emerges top down by people who are policy experts, who are kind of like deeply engaged in this stuff, who already have like their white papers ready to go about exactly what kind of legislation they'd like to see in regulating artificial intelligence. So like that is important, but it's also important to pay attention to the way that people are actually using these things in their real lives. I'll give you another example of this. If you think about the way that ChatGPT over the last year has totally upended all kinds of education, right? All kinds of higher education, high school, even middle school, because there are plenty of assignments that have been assigned by teachers for decades that all of a sudden a machine can do those assignments instantaneously, right? Write a 5-paragraph essay on whoever, the machine can spit it out in 30 seconds. And so there's a need to kind of like reconfigure the state of certain higher education because of those changes. Now, you could imagine like someone top down saying like, here's how you deal with those issues. Here's how you deal with plagiarism in the age of AI. What is actually happening, which I think is more important and actually more interesting, is lots of teachers independently coming up with with policies and strategies to deal with these technologies, slowly over time developing consensuses and sharing notes and figuring out what are we actually trying to teach to students in the age of AI. Are we trying to teach them the same things because those essays are important, even if a machine can do it anyways? Or are we trying to prepare our students for a world in which those kinds of skills are actually no longer necessary? And so we're figuring out what is the next set of skills that need to be learned, assuming that artificial intelligence is going to be ever available. And so, how do we train our students to use it, but then go on to do the next thing? And so these are the kind of questions where like, I don't pretend to have an answer to that question. I think instead the best process and the kind of natural process is to look to people who are actually experimenting with these things, going through the kind of difficult local trial and error process of seeing what works and what does not, to develop regulations that way. This is important because, it's one thing to create regulation around artificial intelligence, but regulation doesn't make up for the need for moral intuitions. At the end of the day, people need to have kind of moral intuitions around how these things ought to be used in their lives. That is something which doesn't develop instantly. It's a slow process. It's also a local process, right? Like the way that people think about artificial intelligence in one community might actually look quite different from the way it looks in other communities. There's already some anecdotal evidence actually that people who believe in God are more likely to trust the responses given by artificial intelligence, which is fascinating, and I would love to understand exactly what's going on there. But that local element, that trial and error element, is important. So there's all kinds of ways that you can imagine Jewish law having an impact on these conversations. That being said, I want to kind of like give a big asterisk to everything that I have said so far. And the big asterisk is that I think it is, while it is useful to think about these Jewish sources having something to say about artificial intelligence, I think we shouldn't kid ourselves about their ability to kind of like set, policy at a company like OpenAI, as OpenAI or Tesla or whoever else thinks about how they're going to change, how they're going to regulate the devices, right? When Tesla tries to figure out what are the limits to the ways that we allow our cars to make decisions in complicated driving situations, I think it is unlikely they're going to look to something like the Mishnah or the Talmud to figure that out. Not just because like those are the sources of a minority Canadian and American community, but also because a lot of the ideas that are expressed there, right, like the idea that if you have more control over something, you're more liable. If it has more independence, you're less liable. Or the idea that devices with a history of violence or a history of being misused should probably, there should be more liability for those things. Like, yes, those ideas are contained in the Mishnah, but they're contained in lots of places. Like, it's not like Jews have a monopoly over those ideas. They already exist in other legal systems. They exist in Canadian legal systems. They exist in the American legal system. And it's a much of an easier reach to pick those ideas out of existing secular legal frameworks than to go to Jewish law. And to add on top of that, the number of steps that you have to go through from a Mishnah that is about an ox and the rules of liability around an ox goring somebody to a self-driving car, there's so many steps you have to go through that by the time you get to that final regulation, you can barely recognize that there was a rabbinic source involved at all. So I say this because while these sources are relevant, I actually don't think that this is the primary way in which we should think about artificial intelligence, the regulation of artificial intelligence and Jewish law intersecting, because it's an area where I think ultimately we are less likely to have any kind of real impact. And I think it's an area where, these are the sources that are kind of the easiest reach. They're the sources that, like, if you, I'm trying to think of the example of this. If you found a rabbi in the street and you said, like, I'm giving you 2 hours to write a class around how artificial intelligence and Jewish law intersect, like, I think these are the sources that would come up because like they're more top of mind and because they're about normative regulation. At the same time, I think they're the ones that are likely to be less impactful. Before we go into the next section, I'm curious if there's questions about this piece.
I have one question.
Yeah.
So if we to go by the assumption for the time being that most experts in halakha are unfamiliar, let's say, with the technical aspects of AI, who should they turn to for advice?
I think it's a great question. And I think going back to the idea about Judaism and medical ethics, one of the reasons that Judaism developed a great understanding of medical ethics and has like at this point, a pretty rich body of literature is that, first of all, Jews have been doctors for centuries. Jews with like a deep knowledge of Jewish law have been doctors for centuries. And so because of the kind of confluence of medical and Jewish legal knowledge, they have been writing for a long time about how those two things interact. Many of the most important books of Jewish medical ethics have been written by rabbis who were consulted by doctors who were part of their congregations who were saying, like, I need an answer to this particular question. Can you help me answer this? So the fact that you have, you have rabbis who are directly in touch with practitioners has meant that you have medical ethics developing naturally. For a lot of reasons, this is happening much more slowly around artificial intelligence and other technologies, in part because it's like literally the geography of it, right? Like there's if like the center of American Jewish thought is like more unlike in the northeast of the United States, whereas like Silicon Valley is somewhere else. That means that there's fewer chances for those players to interact with each other. It's also different because in the case of medical ethics, a lot of the times the questions that doctors are asking are questions that they have the ability to, they actually have a lot of agency, right? Like if a doctor is asking, how do I conduct this procedure? What do I do for this particular patient? Like they are ultimately the decision maker. This is quite different from, a developer in a software company who may be one of like 10,000 developers working on a project where their ability to control the end product is ultimately quite small. And so the ways in which the kind of questions that those developers, even the ones who are interested in Jewish perspectives, the ways that they ask questions of rabbis is much more limited. And so because of that, there has not been that same kind of that natural education. Because of that, I think it's actually important to kind of go out of the way and provide Jewish leaders with some better understanding of these technologies, because I think there still is a role to play. But it has not happened naturally. I think that's why. Yeah, Diana.
Well, I wonder if there have been cases of software developers who have consulted. I don't know if you would know this, who they consult. It would have never occurred to me, but maybe there are people who have about to develop a product or whatever.
Yeah, if they have, it's been very rare. One question that I've seen come up, but it's still a pretty marginal question, is things like, can I keep my website open on Shabbat? Like if I have an e-commerce platform, can I keep it open on Shabbat? Most rabbis say yes, actually, which surprises me. I think the answer should be no. There are a few websites, like ArtScroll's website, Jewish publisher, B&H, which is like like they sell audio video equipment run by Hasidic Jews in the New York area. Those websites are closed on Shabbat, but it's the exception rather than the rule. So I think mostly these questions are not being asked for those kind of demographic and geographic reasons. So this kind of angle on Judaism affecting AI regulation, I think is going to be less effective. I think what is more likely to happen is artificial intelligence is going to have an impact on the way that Jews see Jewish law. So here I want to show you a second set of sources. First I want to well, actually, let me ask you, in your last session, did you talk about the alignment problem?
No.
Okay, it's great. So just very, very briefly, one of the major questions we have in the development of artificial intelligence is this problem of how do we make sure the things we want end up being the things that artificial intelligence want. That is to say, how do we make sure that our interests are aligned with an AI's interests? This turns out to be a pretty hard problem. And just to give you an example of how hard of a problem is, I want to show you a few examples of this kind of not working out well. One of the kind of like chief inspirations for many people in this field of like what it means to think about aligning AI interests with human interests is actually science fiction. And like, while this seems a little bit silly, one of the things that I kind of love around modern technology is like these technologies are often developed initially in fiction and then become real, and then the real things inspire more fiction, and then that further fiction becomes real again. So there's like this interplay between things going in and out of fiction, in and out of fantasy. And so like the fiction is like not a kind of side player, it's actually like kind of an integral part in the conversation, because it is both the product of technological development and also the inspiration of further technological development. So in this conversation, one of the most important players is Isaac Asimov, a Jewish science fiction writer, I think born somewhere in Eastern Europe. I think even he is not sure which country he was born in. He writes hundreds of books. And in those books and his novels, he develops these, what he calls the 3 laws of robotics, which have ended up being quite important. The first law being that a robot's not allowed to injure is not allowed to injure a human being, or through inaction allow a human being to come to harm. The second is a robot has to obey orders given by human beings unless that interferes with the first law. And the third law being a robot should protect its own existence as long as such protection does not conflict with the first or second law. Seems simple enough, right? Seems like that should get you quite a ways to making sure AIs don't hurt people. It turns out it's more complicated than that, right? Because law is complicated, because there's all kinds of exceptions, because there's all kinds of fuzziness. And in fact, like Asimov wouldn't have included these laws in his books if there wasn't a good story to tell around how they get violated or seem to get violated every now and again. It also shows up in actually the very first text that uses the word robot, which is a Czech play written in the 1920s. In this play, you have robots that look exactly like human beings. They're indistinguishable from human beings. And in the play, the robots are already saying to each other, you know, slaughter and domination are necessary if you want to be like man. Read history, read human books. You have to domineer and murder if you want to be like men. That is to say, one of the things we know about artificial intelligence is that it learns from us. And we've known that even before we actually had our real artificial intelligence to use. And the fact that artificial intelligence learns from us is both good, like it's a desirable property. We want artificial intelligence to imitate us because we often want it to act like us. But it also means that sometimes AI picks up characteristics that we'd rather it did not have. So for example, just to give you an example from a few years ago, Microsoft put out a chatbot on Twitter called Tay. Tay, within the first few hours, was fed all kinds of terribly racist information and Holocaust denialism, and so immediately started like kind of spouting these, this kind of white supremacist Nazi propaganda, Holocaust denialism as a result of that. This is kind of an extreme example of a machine that was really kind of tricked into saying the wrong thing, but it happens in artificial intelligence systems all the time. You see bias against people based on their race, based on gender, things like that, not necessarily because someone was trying to do that, but because they read the internet, and the internet has those biases in it, and so the AIs pick up on those biases, right? We can't help but have the AIs pick up on their biases because they are seeing things in the way that we act, in the way that we, for example, online, you will often see, Black people associated with crime in certain websites and certain online discussions. And so the AIs end up doing the same thing. And so AIs need to kind of like be untaught those associations in order to have them be unbiased. This is a kind of an ongoing problem. This is part of what makes the alignment problem difficult. This is not a small problem. In fact, it may not be a solvable problem. Nick Bostrom, who's been talking about artificial intelligence for forever, who wrote a key book on this called Superintelligence, frames this as what he calls the paperclip problem. In source number 15, he says, suppose we have an AI whose only goal is to make as many paperclips as possible. Well, the AI will quickly realize that it would be much better if there were no humans, because humans might decide to switch it off. Because if humans do so, there would be fewer paperclips. Also, human bodies contain a lot of atoms that can be made into paperclips. The future that the AI would be trying to gear towards would be one in which there are a lot of paperclips, but no humans. So it's like a kind of silly example, right? Like if you forget to tell the AI that it probably shouldn't kill people as it's trying to make as many paperclips as possible, that's not a good idea. And you would think like, well, oh, it's a simple fix to get rid of that issue. Just, insert one more line of code about not killing people. It's not so simple. It's not so simple. And if you work in software development, you know that these are problems which will actually never go away. Already in the 1980s, Fred Brooks wrote this kind of seminal essay called No Silver Bullet, in which he makes the case that software development is hard, and it's always going to be hard. It's going to be hard because the world is complex. The needs are constantly changing. It's actually impossible to create the perfect code base. You will never get there. All code is imperfect. All code will always be imperfect. And that is true for things like an operating system. It's true for Microsoft Word, and it's true for artificial intelligence, which is, far, far more complicated than many other systems that we're developing. The reason that I bring this up, just kind of like, I know this is a bit of a long walk, but the reason I bring this up is because I think this is actually very helpful in creating a kind of sympathy for Jewish law. And I think it resolves a lot of the tensions that many people have around the way that Jewish law functions, and especially the way that Jewish law functions when it seems to be saying things that are unjust. I want to give you an example of this. So one question that people often have around Jewish law, one of the texts that most frequently comes up in conversations around like, why would Judaism, why would God say this, is Leviticus 18:22. Do not lie with a male as one lies with a woman. It's an abhorrence. It's an abomination, right? So like one of the kind of central texts that ends up leading to all kinds of discrimination against, same-sex marriages, same-sex couples, all the things like that. Now, there's many different approaches to dealing with texts like this within the Jewish tradition. Some of them to say ignore it or we move past it. The one that I find most compelling, and I think has actually gained some traction in recent years, comes from Rabbi Steve Greenberg, who is, I think, the first Orthodox rabbi who is openly, who came out as being gay. And in his book about the topic and about how he thinks about these sources, he comes up with this kind of novel idea where he says, thinking about the possible reasons for commandments, despite the speculative nature of the endeavor, is important in two ways. First, reasons help us think more deeply about the possible good the Torah is seeking to achieve. By clarifying the various possible benefits that the fulfillment of the commandments might bring about, we are better equipped to implement them. Until we grasp the reasons of the laws, its attempt to achieve the good in some way, we cannot effectively apply it to various situations. Second, seeking the understanding of a scriptural law is a scriptural path for grasping the mind of the lawgiver, for knowing and ultimately loving God. Even more powerfully, the good reasons behind the laws of the Torah assure us of God's love for us. The law is not a tool of divine control, but a gift of divine love. In the Ethics of the Fathers, the sages teach that God gave the Torah to Israel out of love. They add that a love greater than his was shown to the people of Israel when God made known to them that the Torah was not merely divine legislation, but a teaching of the works of goodness. Reasons make known to us the workings of goodness in the law. So Greenberg's approach to this particular verse and to many verses in the Torah is to say basically like, you have to understand why it is there. You have to provide reasons for it. And the reasons are important because they both provide some sympathy for the legislation, for this law, but also can give you context that can help you understand why it may no longer apply today. So for Greenberg, he comes up with ideas around like, well, maybe this is about, certain kinds of, patterns of domination. Maybe this is about certain kinds of families that the Torah is trying to create. But basically, he tries to salvage this verse by suggesting that even though this particular law is one that he finds abhorrent, there are values behind it that he actually agrees with. And what he's doing there is basically trying to say, listen, there's only so many ways that you can get society to act in the way that you want it to act. At the end of the day, you have to come up with some rules. And those rules are never going to be perfect. This, to my mind, is actually exactly the same thing that we are dealing with now in regulating artificial intelligence. Because, as I said before, there's no perfect code. And no perfect code means that there's no perfect code for anybody, no matter how amazing you are. You can believe in a perfect God, but belief in a perfect God doesn't mean that perfect code exists. And I think there's actually good argument to be made from artificial intelligence that there is no way that the Torah could possibly have been a perfect set of instructions. In fact, the rabbis are constantly supplementing additional rules beyond what is given in the Torah, because there is a sense that there's no such thing as complete code. And if you understand the Torah as code, you understand and have, I think, some amount of sympathy for the fact that, God tries to create a code that achieves a certain kind of society, but it ultimately falls short and needs to be updated and updated and updated ad infinitum. I think that is helpful in understanding that. I think that provides some sympathy. So I find this personally helpful in thinking about what it means to have law, what it means to have legislation in a Jewish context, as to understanding it is basically a kind of divine alignment problem, right? In the same way that we are trying to align AI's interests with our own, God in the Torah is trying to align God's interests with ours. And so we are just kind of like in a different place in that conversation. But again, there is that difficult task of trying to find that alignment. I want to go through the last piece of this and then ask if there's any questions. So sorry, I've been talking for a while. So one piece of this is to think about what legislation might Judaism suggest for AI regulation. The second is to think about how the general issues around AI alignment might give us some sympathy for the way the Jewish law itself develops and the way that all legal systems develop. But there's a third piece. The third piece is, in general, how ought we to think about AI's place in our society? And one thing that I am concerned about in that context is that AI, without anybody actually, saying that this ought to be the case, is taking on the role of a kind of God, is taking on a kind of divine role. Here's what I mean by that. Give you an example. Here is a picture of a robotic priest that kind of made the news a number of years ago. A kind of Buddhist priest that kind of like, would spout different sayings. There are ways in which language that we associate with divinity are already being used around artificial intelligence, that it is omniscient, that it is a kind of black box that we don't understand, that it is incredibly powerful. There are people like Yuval Noah Harari who are saying things like, we ought to be careful because maybe AI will come up with its own religious text and try to gain a following and become persuasive and things like that. So there is an element in the contemporary discourse around AI, much of it actually not being generated by people who are religiously inclined, that is pushing in the direction of AI is something like a kind of God, or ought to be thought of as kind of God, or that is an acceptable position. I think this is incredibly dangerous for a number of reasons. From like a Jewish perspective, you could say it's idolatry, but like leaving that aside, I think it's problematic because one of the things that treating an AI as a God does is that, again, prevents it kind of shields its developers from liability, right? If you think about the AI as a kind of as a powerful force in the world, when it is not completely understood, then the people who develop that force can kind of like remove themselves from the role of being its generators, its creators, and their kind of ongoing responsibility to ensure that it does not have ill effects in society. That's one piece of it. But the second piece, though, is I think there is another metaphor which is actually much more suitable and much more useful in thinking about what artificial intelligence is in relationship to us. And that is not AI as a God, but AI as a child. That AI is a kind of child, a child of humanity. To kind of get at this, I want to show you a text from Mara Benjamin, who's a philosopher and Holyoke. Mira is talking in her book, The Obligated Self, which I highly recommend. It's like very short and also very good, which is like the right combination. She is trying to kind of excavate extract from the Jewish tradition philosophical ideas, theological ideas around motherhood, around caregiving, things like that, suggesting, I think, a little bit different from other Jewish feminists, not necessarily that the Jewish tradition is anti all of these things and you just have to kind of develop new texts, but that there actually is within the Jewish tradition a kind of unspoken, underdeveloped ideas around what it means to be a mother, what it means to be a caregiver, things like that. Part of what she does in that context is think about what does it mean to talk about obligation, not in the sense of I am obligated to God or I am obligated to my parents, but I am obligated to my child. And what she points out is the kind of obligations that people have towards their children are in some ways actually much more robust and much more open-ended than the kind of relationship that a person has with their parents. In part because when you have a kid, you have no idea what that kid's going to be. And so you have no idea what direction that obligation is going to go in. She writes, in my child, I recognized that one person from whom I felt I could not walk away. I found it unthinkable that I would refuse the role into which my new child had, by the fact of her existence, suddenly put me. To be an obligated self was to be subject to the law of another, the law of the baby. Every child issues his or her own law. The baby who is colicky, the baby who is attached to tubes and needs his bandages changed to stay alive and healthy. The baby who needs to be walked around the room at a particular pace to fall asleep. The baby who cannot seem to latch on or refuses a bottle. The baby who calms down at the night at the sight of his older sibling. The baby who simply cannot nap in her stroller. The baby who cackles with joyous laughter at a particular sound. These laws are no sooner issued than they are revoked and new laws are issued. The law of this baby in particular is continually shifting, and so her law is continually eluded and rediscovered. Only care for the baby day in and day out attunes a parent to the subtleties of the shifting ground. That is to say, part of the nature of parents' obligation towards their children is it is constantly changing. The fact that it's constantly changing doesn't mean that it ever lessens. And the thing you cannot do is walk away. You have to kind of stick with that obligation wherever it takes you. I love this for many reasons. One of the reasons I love it is there's a kind of like old trope at this point about people in Silicon Valley accidentally inventing things that have been around forever. Like, what if we have this vehicle that doesn't just transport one person like an Uber, but transports like a whole bunch of people, and instead of just going from one point to another point, it actually goes along some route. Oh wait, I just invented a bus. This happens like all the time, to the point where it's kind of like a joke about this happening. I think there's something similar going on around artificial intelligence, where there is, on the one hand, this excitement about like, wow, wouldn't it be amazing if human beings could create things that are kind of like human beings? And you're like, yeah, there's this thing called children. There's also like a kind of gender element here, where like a lot of the people involved in artificial intelligence are men. I think like they're excited about the idea about like creating something that seems human-like, and leaving aside the fact that like, yeah, human beings make other human beings all the time. Human beings are not infinitely, but like significantly more complicated than artificial intelligences at this point. So I think kind of like it brings the artificial intelligence discussion back to earth. What it also does, however, is it suggests a kind of important baseline rule for how you should deal with artificial intelligence, which is that the most important thing to do is you cannot abandon artificial intelligence into the wild. You never know when you raise an artificial intelligence exactly how it's going to develop. These are systems that are complicated enough that, the way they're developed is still somewhat through trial and error. But once you put these systems into the world, they're very powerful and they cannot be abandoned. They need constant development. And there is an obligation on the part of the developers to ensure that the things that they have let loose into the world do not do harm, do not cause harm, do not do evil. This is an idea which I should say is in line with the way that AI ethicists are thinking about how to regulate AI. I'll give you an example. Like a couple of days ago, I was reading an essay thinking about regulating the GPUs, that is to say, the kind of like the basic processors on which all AI systems are built, because these are still pretty expensive. There aren't so many companies that make them. You could track them, right? Which means that you can kind of make sure exactly who is developing these AIs and where they're developing them, and are they developing them towards good purposes. You can have all kinds of audits. In the US, last week, Joe Biden released an executive order suggesting in this direction that there have to be these kinds of regulations to make sure that whenever an AI system goes into the world, there is an audit to make sure that it will not have dangerous effects. And so I think we are heading in this direction. But I think one of the things that Jewish law can do, because listen, realistically, most Jewish scholars are not going to be the ones writing this legislation. What they can do, however, is provide directionally ideas around how we should think about AI regulation and AI's place in society. And this basic idea of AI as a kind of child, a child for which we have a heavy and ongoing responsibility to raise it, to make sure it doesn't do damage, to make sure that it acts well in the world. I think this is a useful metaphor for which a lot of other ideas around specifically how AI ought to be regulated can emerge. But the basic idea that we should reject AI as a kind of God and instead embrace this idea of AI as a kind of progeny, I think is a good place to start there. So let me stop there and take questions.
First of all, thank you so much. That was extremely interesting, at least from my perspective. I think it was from everybody else here too, I hope. And we've got about 15 minutes more before we wrap up. So if anybody has questions for David Zvi, you can just go ahead and unmute your microphone, I think, and offer them that way, or if you're more comfortable, use the chat.
Hi, I put a question in the chat about AI and entertainment. I understand right now the whole reason why actors are on strike is because AI is being used in the entertainment industry without any regulation, especially regarding scanning dead celebrities' facial and body uses imagery for use in movies written by AI, so no actors or writers are getting paid. So I'm curious what your perspective on regulation with regards to AI in the entertainment industry. As we all know, there's quite a lot of Jews in the entertainment industry.
Yes, that's definitely true. Yeah, it's a major issue. I'm glad that it is front and center because I think this is exactly the time to have that conversation. The issue that I think is central here is one about human dignity, and making sure that people do not feel like their likeness, their ideas are being abused in various ways. Now, the question is, how far do these AI technologies and companies need to go to make sure that people's likenesses and people's ideas do not end up getting mimicked in ways that either prevent them from earning a livelihood or after their death mean that their images are being used in ways that they find objectionable. One of the texts that I think actually, which we didn't get to, which I think speaks to this quite well, is a debate between Hillel and Shammai, two rabbis who are constantly arguing in the Talmud around what to do if you have a house that is built using a stolen beam. A house that's built using a stolen beam. Shammai argues, well, if the house is built using a stolen beam, you just have to destroy the house to get the beam back. And Hillel says, no, you just compensate the person, for the value of the beam, but don't destroy the beam as a result of this. I think this has direct implications for questions like this, both because I think it's inevitable that these lines will get transgressed. So the question is, what do you do in those situations? What do you do if someone's persona is being used without their permission? How do you compensate them? And also there's a question around what do you do if you train an AI model? And these models are expensive to train. They cost, tens of millions, hundreds of $millions to train. And that AI model includes data from a person who says, actually, I didn't want my data to be part of that model. I didn't want it to be able to write in my style, which I know, the New York Times is currently suing OpenAI around exactly this question. It doesn't want OpenAI to have access to its data, which is already baked into the model and can't just be extracted. So I think it's an important question to be asked now. It's also important because, look, there are actors who very much do want their likenesses to be used. I know there's an online personality now who says openly, listen, you want to use my voice in a song? Great, you can use my voice in a song. You don't need to ask my permission beforehand. Just give me 50% of the royalties. That's the system. Or there's someone, who people just want to spend a lot of time with her. So she says, you know what? Well, you can't spend time with me, but I'll make a digital replica of myself, and you can pay to spend time with that digital replica of myself. So again, this is an area where, like the question of plagiarism in the age of AI, I don't know that it makes sense to kind of come with a top-down answer of how to resolve these things. And instead, I'm curious to see how both unions and also individual entertainers choose to deal with these issues.
Anyone else have a question for WC? Norman.
Yes, yes, it was very interesting hearing this. Sorry, I missed a little part of the first part, but it was very good and stimulating thought. Wondering what has been, how has AI been used in Jewish law and other law, in the sense that laws are typically created by groups of people for their own rights or to reduce the rights of others. And in the modern world, people will take a certain issue and try and promote a law around it and that. But with AI, you have it just floating out there looking at a lot of written things without any particular agency to it. I imagine, though, that certain groups are going to start to try and use it in that way, but it seems that that's the currently missing part of it. If you know what I'm saying.
I think I understand your question. I'll say that one thing that someone pointed out to me is that Jewish law in particular is overdetermined, meaning there are tools at a rabbi's disposal to get to all kinds of different answers, depending on what answer they're trying to get to. And AI kind of exposes that, because you could just tell the AI, get me to this answer, and it'll get you to the answer. We're going to talk about that actually next time a little bit more, exactly how to resolve that. But I think it is a major issue, because you don't want to end up in a situation where AI ends up making you feel like the law is essentially meaningless, or just a kind of facade or a screen, but ultimately has no value. So I think there is a real risk there, but I think it can be avoided.
Yeah, and I guess the other question, I know we're going to have other sessions talking, but AI and, well, even robots have very limited capacity to act, but thoughts and laws turn into actions. How is that gap going to be bridged, that AI can say things, that don't make sense? And I think there was some recent research showed between 3 and 27% of answers in AI are called hallucinatory, clearly false.
Yeah.
And when it doesn't act, how can AI have constraints? Because at least most judges, most courts have a sense, okay, this will turn into action, so it has to have some reasonableness. AI wouldn't have that. It doesn't act in the world, doesn't feel anything.
Yeah, I think so. There's a kind of open question now about, could you talk about an AI wanting things? This is an area where people like Eliezer Yudkowsky, who's like an AI doomer, who thinks the AI is going to literally kill everybody, will say, I don't know, it may not want things the way that human beings want things, but it may want things in ways that are consequential nonetheless. So I think there's still kind of an open question there about exactly what it means to think about AI agency. In terms of the hallucinations, I'm curious to what degree we can ever completely eliminate them. It seems like they're going to be here for a while. That being said, the technology is moving quite quickly, and at the same time, with all kinds of with all kinds of digital tools, I think we accept a certain amount of error, and we kind of grow to learn what kinds of errors to expect. Maybe that hallucinations are the kinds of things that we end up growing to expect, in the same way that so there's certain kinds of human errors that we grow to expect, or maybe not. Maybe we won't become tolerant of it.
Yeah, it was concerning that they gave this AI, devices fairly small amounts of text and asked them to summarize it, and they made all kinds of assumptions, things that weren't in there, which, as you say, people do. But you're thinking, if people think this is without any bias, without any prejudice, I mean, it was just assuming all kinds of things that are clearly not in the text.
Right.
Pretty concerning, I thought.
Right. So the way that the European Union, for example, is thinking about this kind of regulation is to kind of rank AI systems in terms of their kind of mission, how mission critical they are, right? Like incredibly important systems, the tolerance for those kinds of mistakes is going to be low. For lesser systems, maybe it's more okay to have those kinds of errors.
We have a hand up. Diana has her hand up. Anyone unmute yourself?
Okay. I'm not even sure how to phrase my questions. It's like you sparked lots of ideas. By the way, I did study. I've taught AI. My PhD is in AI, but from time ago, and I'm Jewish. Well, okay. But one question that I'm having is, you talked about Helen and Samai, and those two perspectives of destroying the house or giving compensation. And I'm teaching also. I teach. And so I'm wondering if that reminds me of this of, don't use ChatGPT, the students, don't use ChatGPT versus put a reference to it. So in the end, there is the opinion of Hillel, there is the opinion of Shammai, but what message is there? But further, my question goes to, well, should we educators get inspired in Judaism or other religions? Should there be a conversation with specialists in religion, like yourself or others, to create regulations for education? And maybe that's what's coming up next week or whenever the next meeting. But I'm trying to, I would have never thought that there could be inspiration in these examples with animals or whatnot, but maybe there is more. And maybe we should go to that, because I think that there is a general desire, need to do regulations. And I would have never thought that maybe there are answers already. So I'm not quite sure what I'm asking, but I don't know if you have anything to say about what I'm trying to further my thoughts here.
I think there is a need for regulation. I'll say one thing that I would like to see changed is, right now there's a sense that the people driving the bus are the AI developers themselves, and people who find themselves in jobs that are being radically changed because of AI just feel like they're like, hapless victims, or, to this AI revolution. I think that dynamic should change. I think the people who are on the front lines of this, for whom AI really does affect their work, actually have an important role to play in developing on the ground norms of use. And I think that is often lost, in part because people feel like, I'm just like in my classroom, like, well, what role do I have to play against this gigantic company with hundreds of millions of users? But actually, that, I think it's important to push back against that, because there really is going to be no other counterbalance to the developers if it's not for people on the ground. So I think part of the work is not just kind of spreading ideas, but empowering people to feel like they have a role to play in the development of these new norms. That they're not just they're not the only ones who are worried about these things. They're not the only ones who are trying to resolve these issues. Austin, just before you get to the question, Emily, when the pandemic started, I moved my office into my basement. This is a room that's unfinished. It's full of power tools. There's a 3D printer going over there right now. People kept asking me, are you talking to me from inside of your sukkah? Because it's just a bare paint, it's a bare wooden wall. And so my daughter and I painted these replicas of Keith Haring paintings on the wall behind me, which makes me very happy. And it's distinctive enough that when I'm in a group session that like people know that I'm not there because it's like, oh, like that guy with like the weird paintings behind him is like not in the room right now. So it's like both a blessing and a curse because of that. Anyways, Austin.
Austin, we'll give you the last question, then we'll wrap it up, okay?
Thank you for your talk today. I found it really interesting. And there was something you said, and maybe it was more of a passing comment, but it really caught my attention. And you said that facial recognition technology should probably be legal. And so I was wondering, what about what in Jewish law led you to that conclusion? And the reason I ask is because it seems to me that the algorithms themselves are very difficult to regulate, but the use cases are not. But the use cases are something that we already regulate in terms of public policy, and therefore, how different should the way we approach public policy be because of AI?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. In terms of how I am approaching this, obviously, like, it's my extrapolation. It's not like, obvious from the Jewish sources. Where I get it from personally, and I've written about this directly, is that after the Holocaust, there was a attempt to figure out what ought to be the source of ethics if it is not going to be God. Because I think after the Holocaust, a lot of Jewish theologians basically lost faith in God as being something that people turn to as being a source of what is right and wrong. One of the responses was given by a philosopher named Emmanuel Levinas, a French philosopher, and his idea was basically that that morality comes from encountering other people, and that there's something like really kind of primal that happens in what he says, like looking at the face of the other, that leads to this kind of like instantaneous reaction of "thou shalt not kill," and as a result of that, that is like, from that, like, don't kill other people, all the rest of ethics follows. That's his idea. I find that very powerful. Because I find it powerful, I worry about the commoditization of faces, like literally the like of actual faces, of getting to a place where people think about faces as just like more data, and not just more data, but data that can be like easily replicated. Like we have like, all kinds of photorealistic face generators. So I think there is a kind of particular, we should have particular trepidation around the way that we digitize the human faces, human voices, things like that, because I think it does have a particular kind of alienating power. That's kind of where I'm coming from there.
Thank you, Austin. Thank you, David Zvi. Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. Really fascinating conversation. Just what I was hoping to have happen, and at a level that I knew I couldn't provide after it took me, just weeks to get enough together for the sermon. So this takes it to the area that I was hoping we would get to. I look forward to our next session, which I think the next one's on education, and then the one after that is on can AI be human? I think the next one's in December. I should look up the date, but it's a few weeks away still. Thank you all for joining us tonight. We'll put the recording up online. And David Zvi, any final comments or thoughts? Okay. It's late where you are. It's not so early where we are here. So good night, everyone. Stay safe, and hopefully we'll see you in synagogue over the weekend. Okay. Be well.
Thank you. Bye.